I caught my wife cheating with my best friend, right in front of me, and I didn't even realize it. What started as a fun trip with friends turned into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Let me tell you how it all unraveled. When I first heard this kind of story, I thought, how could someone miss all those signs? Betrayal, retribution, wild swinger escapades, and, of all things, a missing pair of panties. It sounds like a script straight out of some twisted soap opera. If you had told me I'd be living it, I would have laughed. But let me tell you something, it's not as easy to spot as you'd think. You don't expect it. You don't look for it. And before you know it, it hits you like a brick wall. Looking back now, the part that gets me the most is how clueless I was. I mean, we all hear these stories, right? Some poor soul discovers their partner's cheating, and you can't help but ask yourself, how could they not see it? Well, let me explain, it's not that simple. When you're living it, you don't notice the cracks as they're forming. You think everything's fine. You trust them because, well, why wouldn't you? You've got enough going on in your own life to worry about snooping through someone else's. Clara, my wife, or at least, she was my wife, never gave off any flashing red alarms. Or maybe she did, and I was just too distracted to see them. I guess that's the problem with hindsight, it always comes with perfect clarity, long after the damage is done. Here's the thing about Clara, she was a woman who was always busy, always juggling something. Meetings, work events, dinners, she had a packed calendar. I didn't pay much attention, if I'm being honest. She'd come home and chatter about her office, who got promoted, who was dating who, and the drama of her coworkers. I'd sit there, nodding along, pretending to care. If I could go back, maybe I'd listen more carefully. Maybe I'd notice the little things, those subtle shifts that told me something wasn't right. But I didn't. And now, here I am, telling you how I found myself blindsided by a betrayal that still feels unreal. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill affair. No secret meetings in a parked car, no lipstick-stained collars. Clara's infidelity was something else. It had layers, layers I never could have imagined. And trust me, once you hear this story, you'll understand why I still haven't wrapped my head around it. She did it with my best friend. Let that sink in for a moment. And the worst part? It happened right in front of me. Yeah, you heard that right, I was in the same room, completely oblivious to what was going on. It still twists my stomach just thinking about it. But before we dive into that train wreck of a moment, you need to understand the group we used to spend our time with. There were 10 of us, a close-knit group, or so I thought. We did just about everything together. Holidays, weekend trips, dinners at each other's homes. Some of us were married, some dating, and a few stuck somewhere in between. To me, these people were more than friends, they were family. And then there was Tom. Tom was one of my best friends, or at least, that's what I believed back then. He was the kind of guy people gravitate toward. Women especially. He had this charm, this natural ability to make anyone feel at ease, like you'd known him forever. But when it came to relationships, the guy couldn't catch a break. It was like every time he got into a relationship, it was doomed to fail. He'd date someone for a few months, and then, poof, it was over. He'd laugh it off with one of his signature lines, like, well, that's life, right? And we'd all chuckle, shrug, and move on. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder if I should have dug deeper into why none of his relationships ever lasted. Then there was his sister, Martha. Now, Martha was a whole different story. She had this presence about her. You know the type, the kind of woman who steps into a room and everyone turns to look. It wasn't just her looks, though. She had this confidence, this way of carrying herself that commanded attention. Martha had recently gone through a rough breakup. For a while, we thought she and Tom might start showing up to our gatherings with new dates. But that never happened. She stayed single, and for reasons I couldn't explain, that just seemed to work for her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. All of this, Tom, Martha, our group of friends, it's important because it sets the stage for the betrayal that would turn my life upside down. It's the kind of thing you don't see coming, even when all the signs are staring you right in the face. Martha seemed to enjoy hanging out with us, her brother's group of friends, more than going out to meet new people. At the time, I didn't think much of it. She was comfortable with us, and it didn't seem unusual. But now? Well, looking back, I can't help but wonder if there was more to it. About a month before everything fell apart, the group decided to plan a weekend trip together. It was meant to be a simple escape, just us getting away from the usual grind to relax, drink, and share some laughs. We rented this massive cabin out in the woods, though calling it a cabin doesn't really do it justice. This place was huge, more like a villa, with so many rooms you could genuinely lose track of where you were. The idea was to leave the world behind for a while, drink too much, tell ridiculous stories, and just enjoy the break. That first day was a blast. The air out there was so fresh it almost felt like you were breathing for the first time. We laughed, joked, and soaked in the kind of carefree moments we all seemed to need. By the time night rolled around, we were gathered inside, sprawled out in the living room. The fireplace cast a warm glow across the space, and the sound of soft music hummed in the background. Everyone had a drink in hand, the day's laughter still echoing in our conversations. For the first time in a long while, I felt content. It was one of those rare moments where life felt good. Clara was sitting beside me on the couch, smiling like the world was perfect. I remember glancing at her, thinking how lucky I was to have her in my life. Everything seemed fine. And then there was Tom. He was lounging in one of those oversized chairs, beer in hand, looking as relaxed as ever. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But as I glanced over at him, something shiny caught my eye, just a little glint poking out of his pocket. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I looked closer, I realized there was definitely something there. I didn't know what it was at the time. Just a tiny, insignificant detail. Funny how those little things can come back to haunt you. At the time, I wasn't really thinking much about it. We were all pretty buzzed, and the night had taken on that carefree, anything goes kind of vibe. So, without a second thought, and, in hindsight, a serious lack of judgment, I reached over and pulled the shiny object out of Tom's pocket. And there they were, a pair of women's panties. The room erupted into chaos. Drunken laughter echoed off the walls as everyone cracked up at the absurdity of it. I was waving them around like a clown, saying, "Tom, my man, what's this? You trying out a new look these days?" It seemed like the funniest thing in the world. Everyone was in stitches, clutching their sides, tears streaming down their faces from laughing so hard. Tom, though. He kept his cool. He just flashed that easy, laid-back smile of his and said, "Oh, I found them in one of the rooms. Must have been left behind by the last group that stayed here." That alone was enough to keep the laughter rolling, but then he added something that froze the air around me, though I didn't realize it at the time. With that same casual grin, he said, "Hey, maybe they're my sisters. You think she left them lying around?" The room completely lost it. People were doubled over, laughing, tossing out jokes about Tom spying on his sister or who knows what. And me? I was right there with them, cracking jokes like an idiot and playing along, clueless about the reality of what was unfolding. In that moment it was just another drunken gag, a ridiculous, light-hearted memory to laugh about later. Nothing about it felt serious or suspicious. But here's the gut-wrenching truth, those panties. They weren't just anyone's. They were Clara's. My wife's. And there they were, stuffed in my best friend's pocket. Of course, I didn't know it then. At that moment, I was just another fool in the room, laughing, joking, waving them around like they were some kind of party prop. The weight of that realization wouldn't hit me until much later, and when it did, it was like a punch to the chest I'll never forget. For now, though, we were still deep in the haze of alcohol and laughter. Someone eventually suggested we get rid of the evidence, and someone else had the brilliant idea to burn them. I'm pretty sure it was Tom who came up with the idea. He made some offhand joke about the panties being cursed and how we should get rid of them before they brought bad luck. It was late, and we were all far from sober, so naturally, it sounded like the best idea in the world at the time. The whole group stumbled outside, a bottle of whiskey in hand, like we were gearing up for some bizarre ritual. We gathered by the fire pit, laughing like idiots as someone got a flame going. I can't remember who lit it, but I'm almost certain Tom was the one who threw the panties into the fire. As they burned, we all cheered like it was some kind of offering to the gods of drunken debauchery. It was so stupid, really. But in that moment, with all the alcohol clouding our judgment, it was hilarious. We were a bunch of overgrown kids reveling in the ridiculousness of it all. But that was only the first night. 5 days in that cabin, and this was just the warm-up. The next morning, we woke up groggy but still riding the high from the night before. Spirits were good, and with a whole day ahead of us, we decided to take it easy on the drinking until later. We went for a hike, ate a massive lunch, and eventually made our way back to the villa to relax. The panty-burning incident had become a running joke by then, and I was still chuckling about it, not thinking anything of it. That is, until something else caught my eye. We were all lounging around the living room, half watching some random movie on TV. The scene was laid back, everyone draped across couches and chairs, chatting and scrolling through their phones. But then I noticed it, something red poking out from between the couch cushions. My heart did this weird lurch in my chest, and I felt a knot form in my gut. I reached over and pulled it out, and there it was, a red bra. But not just any red bra. No, this one looked far too familiar. It bore a striking resemblance to the panties we'd burned the night before. And that's when the knot in my stomach started tightening. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I mean, come on, finding a red bra doesn't automatically scream betrayal. But something about it didn't sit right. My gut had this uncomfortable twist that I couldn't ignore. I glanced over at Clara, my wife, who was sitting with the rest of the group, laughing at something Derek had said. She looked so at ease, like nothing was wrong. I held up the bra and said, "Clara, is this yours?" She barely looked at it. Just gave me a quick glance and shook her head with a smirk. "Nope, not mine. Just because it's red doesn't mean it matches, honey." Her tone was light, dismissive, like I'd just asked the dumbest question in the world. But I couldn't let it go. "I don't know, it looks just like those panties from last night. Same exact shade of red." Clara raised an eyebrow at me, her expression shifting from amusement to mild annoyance. She let out this exaggerated sigh and said, "John, seriously? Just because it's red doesn't mean it's the same thing. A lot of women own red underwear. You really think I'd be dumb enough to leave something like that lying around?" Everyone started to chuckle, like it was all one big joke at my expense. I could feel my face heat up, the embarrassment mixing with frustration. I tried to play it off, smiling faintly and dropping the subject, but the knot in my stomach didn't go away. A little while later, when things had calmed down, I pulled Derek aside. Derek was one of the few people in the group I actually trusted, probably because he wasn't particularly close with Clara the way some of the others were. If I was going to confide in anyone, it was him. I laid it all out, the panties from the night before, and now this red bra that looked suspiciously like a matching set. Derek listened quietly, arms crossed, nodding as I spoke. When I finally finished, he shrugged and said, "Man, I really don't think you've got anything to worry about. Clara's not stupid. If she was cheating, she wouldn't leave something like that lying around, especially not here, with all of us around." I stared at him for a moment, hoping for a better answer, but he just shook his head like he thought I was making something out of nothing. "You're probably overthinking this," he said, trying to reassure me. "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, but I wasn't so sure. That doubt wouldn't leave me, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Something just felt off. So, while everyone was outside setting up for another night of drinking and games, I decided to make my next move. I remembered something, a piece of gear I'd packed in my backpack. An old video recorder. The kind that automatically starts recording whenever it senses movement. I'd used it for work projects a while back and had completely forgotten it was still in there. It wasn't much, but I figured it was better than sitting around driving myself crazy. I grabbed the recorder, a plan already forming in my head. When I upgraded my car's dash cam a few weeks earlier, I'd tossed the old one into my bag by accident. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now. It felt like the perfect tool. If Clara and Tom were really up to something, I'd have eyes on them, even if they didn't know it. I'd been shrugging off these uneasy feelings for days, but that night, I was done ignoring them. If there was something to uncover, I was about to find out. That evening, the party got into full swing again. Drinks were flowing, and before long, I was already 3 sheets to the wind. The booze hit me harder than I expected, and eventually, I stumbled off to my room, leaving the others to keep the party going. I barely remember collapsing onto the bed, the room spinning around me before I blacked out completely. I was so far gone, I don't think a bomb could have woken me up. The next morning, Derek was the first to check on me. He gave me one of those friendly, reassuring shrugs when I asked about the night before. Everything was fine, man. Nothing happened. You were out like a light, he said. I stayed up until the end, made sure nothing weird was going on. His words should have put me at ease, but they didn't. Something in my gut kept gnawing at me, that same uneasy feeling I couldn't seem to shake. I forced a nod, muttered a quick, thanks, and headed back inside. And that's when I remembered the recorder. Suddenly, my heart started pounding. In the haze of booze and sleep, I'd almost forgotten I'd set it up. But now, it was all I could think about. I rushed to where I'd hidden it, my hands shaking as I pulled it out. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed play, my heart racing so loud I could barely hear the hum of the recording. At first, there was nothing. Just the muffled sounds of the party carrying on outside, my own snoring faint in the background. But then the door creaked open, and I saw her. Clara. She slipped into the room quietly, almost tiptoeing. She walked up to the bed, stood there for a moment, and then leaned over me. I watched as she kissed me gently on the forehead, like I was a child she was tucking in. And then, from behind her, Tom appeared. My chest tightened as I watched him step into the frame, his figure blurred slightly by the dim light. He leaned in close to Clara, whispered something in her ear that I couldn't quite make out. And then, and this part still messes me up, he leaned down and kissed me, too. Right on the cheek. I sat frozen, staring at the screen, as Clara laughed softly. The sound felt like nails on a chalkboard. Tom muttered something after that, something that sent an icy chill straight down my spine. It's wonderful, isn't it? Then, just as quickly as they came, they left the room, the door closing softly behind them. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to process what the hell I'd just seen. My mind couldn't keep up. What did I just witness? What did he mean by, "It's wonderful"? And why had they both kissed me like that, like some twisted joke at my expense? I replayed the moment over and over, hoping it would make more sense the second or third time around. But it didn't. The knot in my stomach only grew tighter, and suddenly, all those little things I'd been brushing off, the panties, the bra, the lingering looks, came flooding back like a tidal wave. Something was very wrong. Derek had lied to me. That much was clear now. He'd looked me right in the eye and said, nothing happened, but the video said otherwise. Clara had been in my room, laughing with Tom like it was all some kind of sick joke. And as much as I wanted answers, I wasn't going to confront them tonight. I wasn't ready, not yet. That's when I noticed Martha. She slipped away from the group quietly, almost as if she didn't want anyone to see her leave. My instincts kicked in, and before I even knew what I was doing, I was following her. I found her sitting on the edge of the bed in one of the empty rooms, her back straight and hands resting in her lap like she'd been waiting for me. And when I walked in, she wasn't surprised. Not at all. Instead, she looked up at me with this knowing smile that made my skin crawl. She spoke first. "Are you finally ready?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and disorienting. I froze, my brain scrambling to understand what she meant. Ready for what? But something about the way she said it, so calm, so sure, pulled me forward. And right there, in that room, things happened that I still can't fully explain. When it was over, I felt this overwhelming wave of regret crash over me. My stomach turned, my head spinning with guilt and confusion. I stood up abruptly, desperate to leave and put the whole thing behind me. But as I reached for the door, Martha's voice stopped me cold. "I'm glad you're finally part of the club now," she said, smiling like it was the most normal thing in the world. "We don't have to hide it anymore." I froze, my hand gripping the doorknob. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out her words. "What?" I managed to croak, my throat dry. She tilted her head slightly, looking at me with innocent confusion. "I mean, I'm glad Clara finally told you about the whole thing. It's been so hard keeping our swinger parties a secret from you." My entire body went cold. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I turned back to look at her, but she just smiled, completely oblivious to the storm raging in my head. "I get it," she continued casually. "You need a little time to get used to it." I nodded stiffly, my face probably as pale as a ghost. "Yeah," I muttered. I need a little time." Martha's smile widened as she shrugged. "Of course. Take all the time you need." I stumbled out of the room and down the hall, my thoughts spinning in every direction. A swinger club? This whole time? My wife, my friends, living this secret life right under my nose, and I'd been too blind to see it. By the next day, the bomb Martha had dropped on me was still rattling around in my head, but now, I knew exactly what I had to do. I couldn't just sit there, pretending everything was normal. I needed proof. Hard evidence. That night, I played along. I said my goodnights, faked a yawn, and headed to bed like nothing was wrong. At least, that's what they thought. In reality, I was wide awake, lying there in the dark, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. I had my phone ready. Earlier, I'd deleted some old photos and videos to make sure I had enough storage, and I'd downloaded an app that could record video in the background without lighting up the screen. If Clara and Tom, or anyone else, were really up to something, I'd catch it this time. I laid there, barely breathing, the phone tucked under my pillow. My thumb hovered over the record button, waiting. Whatever was happening in that cabin, I was about to find out the truth. I positioned myself perfectly. My phone was angled just right, tucked into place so it could capture everything. I only had one shot at this, one chance to get the proof I needed. I couldn't mess it up. An hour passed. Then two. The house was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnerving when you know something's coming. I stayed completely still, my ears tuned to every creak, every sound in the distance. And then it started, the real show. I won't go into all the details, partly because I don't want this account to get banned, but mostly because I don't want to relive what I saw. Frankly, it was disgusting. They were all in on it, the swinging, the sex. The kind of stuff that makes your stomach twist into knots, makes you feel like you've wandered into some dark, depraved corner of the world you were never supposed to see. These were people I'd called my friends. People I'd trusted. And there was Clara, my wife, right in the middle of it, completely oblivious to how far my trust had been shattered. I felt sick, but I couldn't look away. Every awful second played out in front of me, and my phone silently captured it all, the sounds, the movements, the evidence. That was enough. I couldn't watch anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quietly grabbed my things and slipped out of the house unnoticed. Not that anyone would have cared if they had seen me. They were too wrapped up in their twisted little world to notice anything else. The villa sat kilometers away from where we'd parked the cars. To get there, I had to follow a long dirt road that cut straight through the forest. Walking through the woods alone, in the dead of night, was unnerving, to say the least. The moonlight filtered through the trees in jagged streaks, barely lighting the path ahead of me. Every sound, the rustling leaves, the snapping of a branch, made me jump. My nerves were completely shot, but I didn't stop moving. I couldn't. By the time I reached the car, I felt like I'd escaped something monstrous. The moment I slammed the door shut and locked it, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I sat there for a minute, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart racing as I tried to process what the hell had just happened. The drive back home was surreal. The empty streets stretched on endlessly, the world outside eerily still, like everything around me had frozen in time. It didn't feel real. None of it. I wasn't driving through familiar streets anymore, I was floating through some kind of distorted dream, or more accurately, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My head was spinning. The events of the last 24 hours weighed on me like a boulder, pressing down on my chest until it felt like I could barely breathe. How could all of this have been happening right under my nose? How had I been so blind? And now that I knew the truth, what the hell was I supposed to do with it? I sat in the car for what felt like forever, the engine still running, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the dark outline of my house. The silence inside the car was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I tried to calm the storm brewing inside me, deep breaths, clenched fists, anything, but no amount of mental effort could erase the images burned into my mind. My phone buzzed a couple of times. I didn't bother checking it right away. I already knew who it was. Clara, Tom, maybe even Derek, reaching out to check where I was, to keep the illusion alive. But I was already ahead of them. Still wearing my jacket, I walked inside, heading straight for my desk. The house was dark, quiet, but my mind was anything but. I dropped into my chair, opened my laptop, and stared at the screen for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts. My heart was racing, but my focus was sharp. I couldn't keep all of this bottled up inside, it wasn't just about venting or getting it off my chest. This was about control. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was holding the cards. I had the upper hand, and there was no way I was letting it slip. But I also couldn't afford to be reckless. I couldn't just throw everything out into the open and lose the only leverage I had. No, I needed to be careful, deliberate, precise. I needed to hit them where it would hurt most. The footage was my proof, the undeniable truth of what had gone down in that cabin. And the things I saw through that lens? Well, let's just say they were far too explicit to ever describe here. So, I uploaded the video to a private link. Hidden, locked away, only accessible to those I allowed. It wasn't public, of course, I wasn't that reckless. But I left one thing clear, if anyone wanted to know the truth, if they were brave enough to ask for it, all they had to do was message me, and I'd send them the link. There was this strange rush in the pit of my stomach, part adrenaline, part something else I couldn't quite place. A part of me relished it. The feeling of finally turning the tables. I'd crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross, and I knew it. But in that moment, I didn't care. I'd set the wheels in motion. What would happen next? I had no idea. That night, I didn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying everything in my head over and over until my thoughts blurred together. Then, sometime in the early morning, I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep. It didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. Over and over. Non-stop. I groggily reached for it and blinked at the screen, my heart jolting awake as I took in what I saw. Missed calls, voicemails, texts, they were all flooding in like a tidal wave. The notifications just kept coming. Clara. Tom. Derek. Numbers I didn't even recognize. Friends. People from our group. It was chaos, pure and simple, and I knew exactly what they were all scrambling about. The truth was out there now, waiting like a loaded gun. And suddenly, I wasn't just holding the cards anymore. I was holding a bomb, and it was only a matter of time before it went off. I picked up my phone and started scrolling through the messages. They came in like a flood, panicked texts, missed calls, voicemails piling up one after another. I could almost hear their voices in my head, frantic and desperate, scrambling to keep their dirty little secrets from spilling into the world. They knew what I'd done, and they were terrified. Terrified of what I might do next. But it was too late. What surprised me the most, though, was Clara. Not a single call, not one text from her. Nothing. Her silence stood out like a glaring void, louder than all the other noise combined. Was she trying to play it cool, act like she had nothing to hide? Or was she paralyzed by fear, knowing exactly what I had on her? Either way, the silence was deafening. As the buzzing from my phone finally started to slow, I realized this was just the beginning. I wasn't fazed. In fact, I was more determined than ever. I wasn't interested in arguments or apologies, no more second chances or empty promises. I wanted this over. Done fast, done clean, and with no loopholes for Clara to wriggle through. The marriage was dead, had been for a long time, and there was no way I was letting her walk away from this without consequences. By the time I hung up with the lawyer, my path forward was set. Calls and texts were still trickling in, but the chaos had quieted, for now. It was the calm before the storm, and I knew the damage I'd already done would ripple out. But I wasn't stopping. Not until I had everything I needed to walk away from this wreck of a life for good. And that's when the door opened. Clara walked in like she owned the place, her heels echoing off the hardwood as she scanned the room. I could see it on her face, she expected an argument. Maybe a shouting match. Maybe she thought she could smooth things over, pull her usual tricks, charm her way out of this mess the same way she always had. But then she saw the boxes. Reality hit her like a brick wall. Her confident expression cracked, just for a second, before she tried to recover. "John, wait. This isn't." I didn't want to hear it. Not a word. Before she could even finish the sentence, I held up my hand to cut her off. "No, Clara." My voice was calm, colder than I expected. "We're not doing this. Not this time." Her mouth opened, as if she was going to protest, but I didn't let her. "Save it." I looked Clara dead in the eyes and said, "Go to hell." My voice was calm, steady, but with enough bite to let her know I wasn't bluffing. "If you don't get out of here right now, I'm calling the cops." She froze, eyes widening for just a second, as if she wasn't sure I was serious. Tom shifted uncomfortably beside her, glancing between us, waiting to see how it would play out. Then Clara tried one last time to reason with me, her voice softer, as though a carefully chosen word could fix any of this. I didn't care. Not anymore. I pointed at the door. "Get out." She hesitated, probably trying to find the right angle to sway me, but eventually, they all left. Tom, Derek, anyone who had still been lurking. As they walked out, they muttered threats and insults under their breath, like children throwing tantrums. I didn't even flinch. Their words meant nothing to me anymore. The divorce process, thankfully, was quick. There wasn't much to fight over. Clara knew she didn't have a leg to stand on, and I wasn't about to let it drag out. Within a few weeks, the papers were signed, and it was over. Once the divorce was finalized, I wasted no time. I put the house up for sale. It didn't take long to find a buyer, and honestly, good riddance. That place was full of too many memories, too much pain, and I didn't want any part of it anymore. Within weeks, I packed up everything I owned, loaded it into a moving truck, and left it all behind. I wasn't sure where I was headed next, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep carrying that life with me. And I guess that's where this story ends. I don't know what the future holds for me, and I won't pretend I have it all figured out. But here's what I've learned: I'll never let people get that close to me again. Not after what happened. So to everyone who took the time to read this, thank you. And if I can leave you with one piece of advice, it's this: be careful who you let into your life. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who will destroy you. I packed up everything I owned and moved away from it all. The house, the memories, the so-called friends, I left it behind like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I thought that distance would help, that leaving would somehow erase the damage. But trust? Trust has become this fragile, foreign thing to me. Every time someone tries to get close, I feel myself pulling back, putting up walls so high and thick I don't even know how to tear them down. I still have nightmares sometimes. Not about what happened directly, but about the feeling it left behind, this deep, suffocating sense of betrayal. It's like I can't let my guard down, not even in my sleep. A part of me is always bracing for impact, waiting for the next blow to land. I keep replaying those moments in my head: Clara, Tom, the whole twisted situation. It's a loop I can't quite escape. These days, I keep to myself. I go to work, come home, and focus on rebuilding whatever pieces of my life aren't completely shattered. It's a quiet existence, lonely, even, but it feels safer. I don't have the energy to risk being hurt like that again. Not yet. Maybe one day, I'll find it in me to trust someone again. Maybe I'll meet someone who can chip away at this wall I've built around myself. Someone who can prove to me that not everyone is capable of that kind of cruelty. But for now, I'm content with the distance. It's better to be alone than to risk being destroyed all over again.